Story 1. The Ding Dong Ditch Disaster. It was a perfect Saturday night in the middle of summer. The kind of night where the air is warm, thick with humidity, and the suburban streets feel alive with the quiet hum of sprinklers and the occasional bark of a dog in the distance. For 13-year-olds like me, Mark, James, and Matt, it was a playground of opportunity. Our favorite game? Ding Dong Ditch. If you've never played, it's simple. Pick a house, ring the doorbell, and sprint like your life depends on it. You hide and watch as the poor sucker on the other side of the door stumbles out, groggy or annoyed, looking for the invisible pranksters. It's harmless, or at least we thought so. Until that night. The first few houses were uneventful, textbook even. Ring, run, hide. The same routine. We'd crouch behind bushes or cars, muffling our laughter as an old lady or middle-aged dad would step out, shaking their heads in confusion. It gave us a thrill, the kind of childish rush you can only get from sneaking around at night. But the last house on the block? That was a different story. We'd all heard rumors about the house at the end of Crescent Lane. The lawn was an overgrown mess of weeds. The paint on the house peeled off in huge, ugly strips, and the car that sat in the driveway hadn't moved in years, hidden under a torn, faded tarp. Most kids dared each other just to walk past it, but Mark was fearless, or maybe reckless. "Let's do this one," he whispered, his eyes gleaming under the streetlight. "Are you sure, man?" Matt asked, his voice low. "I don't know about this one. What if someone actually lives there?" Mark waved him off. "Come on, what's the worst that could happen? It's just a game." We hesitated for a second, but the adrenaline, the peer pressure, and that unspoken rule that no one wanted to be the scared one drove us to follow him. Mark was already halfway across the street before any of us could say otherwise. The rest of us hung back, keeping our distance, hiding behind a cluster of overgrown bushes in the neighbor's yard. Mark reached the porch, and for a moment, everything was silent. He stood there, hand poised over the doorbell, the moonlight casting long, eerie shadows across the yard. I could feel the tension rising in my chest. Something about that house felt wrong, like it was watching us, waiting. "Just ring it and run," James hissed from our hiding spot, and then Mark pressed the bell. The doorbell sounded through the quiet neighborhood like a funeral chime, and before Mark could even turn to run, the door swung open. What stepped out onto the porch made my stomach drop. A man, huge and hulking, filled the doorway. He was disheveled, his clothes hanging loosely off his gaunt frame, and his eyes, they were wide, wild, like a predator catching sight of prey. We stifled our gasps as the man stepped onto the porch, his heavy boots thudding against the old wooden boards. He peered out into the night, scanning the yard, the street, the bushes where we were hidden. His breathing was heavy, ragged, like he was holding back rage. For a moment, we thought we were caught. But then, slowly, he turned and stepped back inside, the door slamming shut behind him. Mark sprinted back to us, his face flushed with excitement. "Did you see that guy?" He whispered, grinning like a maniac. "We should do it again." "No way," Matt said, shaking his head. "That dude looked insane. Let's get out of here." But Mark wasn't backing down. "Come on, one more time. I'll be faster this time. He won't catch me." Before we could argue, Mark was already moving again, his figure disappearing into the darkness as he ran back toward the house. My heart was pounding in my chest, a voice in my head screaming at me to stop him, to just go home, but none of us moved. We watched, frozen with fear and excitement, as Mark approached the porch again. He rang the bell, and this time, the man didn't wait. The door burst open immediately, and he stepped out holding something that gleamed in the moonlight. A rifle. We didn't have time to react before the man was stomping through the yard, heading straight for the bushes where we were hiding. My breath caught in my throat as he came closer, his eyes scanning the darkness with a focused intensity. I felt James grip my arm, his nails digging into my skin. We didn't move, barely breathing as the man stopped just feet from us, his finger hovering over the trigger of the gun. He muttered something under his breath, something about kids and teach them a lesson, but I couldn't make out the rest. All I knew was that we were one step away from disaster. Then, out of nowhere, a loud noise echoed through the street, a car backfiring in the distance. The man's head snapped in the direction of the sound, and for a split second, his attention shifted. That was all we needed. Mark, who had been hiding behind a tree across the street, let out a yell. "Run!" The man turned just as we bolted from the bushes, our legs pumping as fast as they could go. We sprinted down the street, not daring to look back, the sound of the man's heavy footsteps following us for what felt like an eternity. By the time we reached the park, a few blocks away, we collapsed onto the grass, panting, our hearts racing. "Holy shit," James gasped, his face pale. We could have died. Mark, still grinning despite everything, shrugged. "Told you it was fun." But none of us laughed. The game wasn't fun anymore. The thrill was gone, replaced by a cold, creeping fear that stayed with us long after that night. We never went back to that house again, and after that, Ding Dong Ditch lost its appeal. Some pranks just aren't worth the risk. Story 2. The Haunted Attic. It's funny how, in the beginning, everything seems normal. You don't notice the little things right away. The strange sounds, the fleeting shadows, the odd sensation that someone or something is watching you. I didn't notice at first either. When I moved into a small rental house near campus for my second year of college, I was thrilled. It was my first real taste of independence, away from the dorms, away from the noise. It was just me and this old charming little house, or so I thought. The first few days were uneventful. I settled in quickly, dragging my boxes into the cramped rooms, unpacking my books, my clothes, my collection of vintage movie posters. The house had this cozy, rustic feel, with creaky wooden floors and high ceilings that gave it a sort of old-world charm. Sure, the place was a bit run down, the paint was chipped, and the windows were a bit drafty, but it had character, or at least that's what I told myself. But it wasn't long before things started to feel off. It started with small noises, a creak here, a thud there. At first, I thought it was just the house settling. After all, it was old, and old houses make noises, right? But soon the noises grew louder, more distinct. I'd be lying in bed late at night, the house quiet except for the faint hum of my fan, when I'd hear it. Scratching. It sounded like something or someone was dragging their nails along the walls, moving slowly, methodically. I tried to ignore it, brushing it off as pipes or maybe even rats in the walls. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. One rainy Saturday afternoon, the sound got worse. I was lounging on the couch, half watching TV, half dozing off when the scraping started again. This time, it was coming from directly above me, the attic. I sat up, my pulse quickening. I hadn't even been up to the attic since I moved in. The door to it was in my bedroom ceiling, one of those old-fashioned ones that you had to pull down with a cord. The landlord had mentioned something about storing old furniture up there, but I hadn't bothered to check it out. Now it seemed like something was trying to get my attention from up there. The scraping grew louder, more insistent, like nails dragging across the wooden floor. I grabbed the remote and turned up the volume on the TV, trying to drown it out, but it didn't stop. My heart was pounding now, a cold sweat forming on the back of my neck. I glanced toward the ceiling, half expecting to see the attic door swinging open, but it remained closed, mocking me with its silence. I tried to push the sound out of my mind, telling myself it was just the rain playing tricks on me. Maybe the wind was pushing against the house, or maybe it really was just old pipes. But deep down, I didn't believe it. That night I couldn't sleep. The rain had stopped, leaving the house in an eerie, oppressive silence. I tossed and turned, every little creak of the floorboards making me flinch. And then around 2 a.m., it happened again. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps coming from the attic. I bolted upright in bed, my heart racing. There was no mistaking it this time. The footsteps were real, and they were right above me. I stared at the attic door, my breath shallow and uneven, my mind racing with possibilities. Was someone up there? Had someone been living in the attic this whole time without me knowing? I grabbed my phone, my fingers shaking as I dialed my friend Ashley. She answered on the third ring, groggy and confused. "Do you know what time it is?" she muttered. "I think someone's in my attic," I whispered, barely able to get the words out. There was a pause on the other end of the line. "What? Are you serious?" "I'm dead serious. I can hear them walking up there right now." Ashley was quiet for a moment before speaking again. "Call the cops." "I don't know. What if it's nothing? What if I'm just hearing things?" "Better safe than sorry," she said firmly. "Call them." I hesitated for a moment before hanging up and dialing 911. I felt ridiculous, explaining the situation to the dispatcher. I could practically hear the skepticism in her voice as she asked me if I was sure it wasn't just the wind. But I insisted, and within 15 minutes, 2 officers arrived at my door. They were polite, but clearly didn't think much of my story. I watched as they pulled down the attic door, their flashlights casting long beams of light into the dusty darkness above. They climbed up the ladder, disappearing into the attic for what felt like an eternity. When they finally came back down, they were shaking their heads. "There's nothing up there," one of them said, his voice calm. "Just some old boxes and furniture. No sign of anyone living up there." I nodded, feeling both relieved and embarrassed. Maybe I really was just hearing things. The officers left, and I locked the door behind them, feeling a little more at ease. But as I climbed back into bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still wrong. And then, at 3 a.m., I heard it again. This time it wasn't footsteps. It was a voice. A child's voice. "Come play with me." The words sent a chill down my spine. I sat up, staring at the attic door, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The voice was soft, almost a whisper, but unmistakable. "Come play with me." I scrambled out of bed, grabbing my keys and my phone. I didn't care what was up there. I wasn't staying to find out. I bolted out the front door, not stopping until I was in my car, driving as fast as I could away from that house. I never went back. I told the landlord I couldn't stay there anymore, made up some excuse about needing to move closer to campus. But the truth was, I couldn't live in a house where I'd heard that voice, where I'd felt that presence. To this day, I don't know what was in that attic. But I do know one thing. Some houses should be left alone. Story 3. The Basement Secret. When I took the job working for Mel, I didn't think much of it. I needed the money, and she needed help around the house. She was old, fragile, and living alone in this enormous, creaky mansion just outside of town. The place looked like it had been plucked straight from a Gothic novel, tall, dark, and almost menacing in the way it loomed over the surrounding trees. The first time I drove up to the house, I was struck by how isolated it was. The driveway was long, twisting through a tunnel of overgrown trees that seemed to close in on you as you drove. By the time I reached the house, the trees had swallowed the road behind me, leaving me with the unsettling feeling that I was completely cut off from the rest of the world. Mel greeted me at the door with a warm smile, her thin, bony hands shaking slightly as she gripped the handle of her cane. Despite her frailty, there was something sharp in her eyes, something that made me feel like she was always watching, always aware of everything that was happening in her house. "Thank you for coming," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I've been needing some help with the cleaning, you see. My health isn't what it used to be." I smiled politely, stepping inside. The interior of the house was just as old and dusty as I'd imagined, with antique furniture and heavy, velvet drapes that blocked out most of the sunlight. The air smelled faintly of mothballs and something else, something I couldn't quite place. "I'll show you around," Mel said, leading me through the house at a slow, deliberate pace. As we moved from room to room, she explained my duties: cleaning, laundry, organizing the clutter that had accumulated over the years. It all seemed simple enough. But then, as we reached the kitchen, she stopped in front of a door at the far end of the hallway. "This," she said, her voice suddenly low, "is the basement." I nodded, waiting for her to continue, but she didn't say anything for a moment. She just stared at the door, her expression unreadable. "You are never to go down there," she said finally, her eyes locking onto mine. "Do you understand?" I blinked, caught off guard by the sudden shift in her tone. Yeah, I won't go down there." "Good," she said, her voice softening again. "There's nothing down there that you need to worry about. It's just old things. Memories I'd rather forget." I nodded again, but a chill ran down my spine. Something about the way she said it didn't sit right with me. The rest of the day went by without incident. I spent most of my time dusting the shelves, wiping down the windows, and trying not to think about the basement. But as the afternoon turned to evening and the house grew darker, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That night, Mel asked me to stay over. She said she had a few more things for me to do in the morning, and since it was a long drive back to town, it made sense to just spend the night. I didn't have any plans, so I agreed. She showed me to the guest room, a small, stuffy room at the back of the house, and wished me good night. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the old house settling around me. The creaks and groans of the floorboards, the faint rustling of the wind outside, it all felt normal. But then, sometime after midnight, I heard it. Footsteps. At first I thought it was Mel. Maybe she was just going to the bathroom or getting a glass of water. But the footsteps were heavy, deliberate, nothing like the slow, shuffling steps I'd heard from her earlier. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. The footsteps continued, moving down the hallway past my door, and then they stopped. I held my breath, listening. The house was silent again, but I could feel my pulse racing in my ears. Something wasn't right. And then I heard it. The faint creak of a door opening, the basement door. I scrambled out of bed, my mind racing. I told myself it was probably just Mel, that maybe she'd forgotten something down there. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. Something else was going on in that house, something Mel hadn't told me. I grabbed my phone, slipping it into my pocket as I crept down the hallway. The house was dark, the only light coming from the sliver of moonlight filtering through the cracked window in the kitchen. I made my way to the basement door, my hand shaking as I reached for the handle. I shouldn't have opened it. I knew that, but curiosity got the best of me. The door creaked as it swung open, revealing a narrow staircase that descended into the darkness. The air that wafted up from below was damp and musty, filled with the scent of rot and decay. I hesitated for a moment, my heart pounding in my chest, but then I heard it. A faint sound coming from below. It was a voice, a soft, muffled voice, like someone was whispering from the depths of the basement. I stepped onto the first stair, the wood groaning under my weight. The voice grew louder, more distinct, but I still couldn't make out the words. I took another step, and then another, my footfalls barely making a sound as I descended into the darkness. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, I flicked on the light switch, and the basement was bathed in a dim, yellow glow. My breath caught in my throat as I looked around. The basement was filled with old, dusty furniture, boxes stacked high against the walls. But in the center of the room, sitting in two wooden chairs, were two decaying bodies. Their skin was leathery and stretched tight over their bones, their empty eye sockets staring out into the room. One of them was dressed in an old-fashioned wig, the other in a beret. I gagged, my stomach lurching at the sight. I wanted to run, to scream, but I was frozen in place. My phone slipped out of my hand, clattering against the cold cement floor. The whispering stopped. For a moment, the basement was eerily silent, except for the rapid thudding of my heart. My mind raced with questions. Who were these people? How long had they been down here? And most terrifying of all, who had put them here? Suddenly, there was a creak behind me. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat. There, at the top of the stairs, stood Mel. Her figure was silhouetted against the dim light from the hallway above, but I could see enough to know something was terribly wrong. She wasn't holding her cane. In fact, she stood straighter than I had ever seen her before, her frail posture gone, replaced by something more menacing. "I told you not to go down there," she said, her voice cold and calm. It was a different tone from the sweet, old woman I had met earlier. This was something else, something dark. My legs trembled as I backed away, my eyes darting between her and the decaying bodies sitting in front of me. Who are they? I stammered, struggling to keep my voice steady. Mel smiled, but it was a twisted, cruel smile, one that made my blood run cold. "They were once like you," she said, stepping closer to the top of the stairs. "Curious, too curious for their own good." I felt a lump form in my throat, dread seeping into every part of me. "What did you do to them?" Her eyes glinted in the dim light, a look of satisfaction crossing her face. "They didn't listen, just like you. But unlike them, you have a choice." I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the edge of a dusty box. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what she was saying, of what was happening. "A choice?" I repeated, my voice barely a whisper. Mel's smile widened. "You can leave this house and never speak of what you've seen. If you do, you'll live. If you tell anyone, even for a moment, you'll end up just like them." The weight of her words pressed down on me like a boulder. I glanced at the bodies again, their leathery skin stretched tight over their bones, their empty eye sockets staring at nothing. Was this really the fate that awaited me if I disobeyed? I won't tell anyone, I managed to choke out. My body trembled, every instinct screaming at me to run, but I knew I had to play along, at least for now. Mel's eyes narrowed, as if searching for any sign of deception. "Good," she said finally. "Now leave." Without another word, she turned and disappeared back up the stairs, the creak of the old wooden boards fading as she walked away. I stood frozen for a moment, my body numb, my mind struggling to comprehend everything that had just happened. Then, without thinking, I bolted up the stairs, leaving the basement behind me. I didn't stop until I was outside, gasping for breath in the cold night air. My car was parked at the end of the long driveway, but the distance felt like miles. I sprinted to it, my heart pounding with a mixture of fear and adrenaline. My hands were shaking as I fumbled with the keys, but I managed to get the door open, throw myself inside, and start the engine. As I sped away from that house, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see Mel standing in the doorway, watching me with that unnerving smile. But the house remained dark and still, like a forgotten relic from another time. I didn't stop driving until I was well out of town, my knuckles white as I gripped the steering wheel. The image of those bodies, decayed and forgotten, flashed through my mind over and over again. And Mel's words echoed in my ears, sending shivers down my spine. For weeks, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw their faces, heard the soft whispering in the basement, felt the weight of Mel's threat hanging over me like a shadow. I thought about going to the police, about telling someone what I had seen, but fear kept me silent. If Mel was willing to go to such lengths to keep her secret hidden, what would she do if I spoke up? Months passed, and I tried to move on, but no matter how far I went, I couldn't escape the feeling that I was being watched, that Mel was always nearby, ready to ensure I kept my promise. One night as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I heard it. A faint whisper like a voice carried on the wind. "Come back." I bolted upright, my heart racing. The room was silent, but the voice lingered in my mind, soft and sinister. I told myself it was just my imagination, just the remnants of a nightmare. But deep down, I knew the truth. Mel wasn't finished with me yet.